It bears an image on it, ventral, front, and back dorsal, of a human figure.
It shows a very faint sort of image of a crucified man. And the crucified man calls us to remember Jesus' death and resurrection.
For more than a century, one piece of cloth has done something almost no other artifact in the world has managed. It has survived fire, war, theft, and ridicule. It has been photographed, X-rayed, sampled, sequenced, and argued over by geneticists, physicists, chemists, and historians who agree on almost nothing else. And in the last 10 years, it has come roaring back into scientific journals with new studies that don't so much settle the question of its origin as reopen it. This is the story of the Shroud of Turin, not the version with all the rough edges sanded off, but the version where the real evidence, the real disagreements, and the real scientists are still arguing today. The story of modern shroud science doesn't begin in a laboratory. It begins in a dark room on the night of May 28, 1898, in the Italian city of Turin. A lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia had been given rare permission to photograph the shroud during a public exhibition, a slow, technical job under difficult lighting, using a large format camera and magnesium flash powder to illuminate a dim cathedral interior. Pia exposed his glass plates and retreated to develop them himself. What happened next has become one of the most repeated moments in shroud lore. As the negative developed, Pia found himself looking at a strikingly clear, positive-looking image of a bearded man's face, deep-set eyes, a broken nose, visible bruising, where the naked eye, looking at the cloth itself, sees only a faint, brownish, almost shadowy imprint. In other words, the image on the linen behaves like a photographic negative. What looks vague and low contrast on the fabric resolves into something sharp and lifelike when the tonal values are reversed. This single observation is genuinely one of the more interesting facts about the shroud, and it isn't in dispute. What's disputed is what it means. Believers in the shroud's authenticity point out that whoever produced the image, whether through natural process or human hand, did something that photography wouldn't exist to explain for another 5.5 centuries. Skeptics counter that a skilled medieval artist working with techniques like a bas-relief rubbing, a heated metal template, or acid-based contact technique could plausibly produce a negative-like image without understanding photography as a concept at all. Image negativity is a property of contrast reversal, not proof of a camera. Both sides agree the image is unusual. They disagree sharply on whether unusual means inexplicable. Skip forward to the 2010s, when genetic sequencing technology finally became sensitive enough to analyze the microscopic material trapped in the shroud's fibers. In 2015, a team led by Gianni Barcaccia at the University of Padua, working with colleagues at the University of Pavia, published a genuine peer-reviewed study in Scientific Reports analyzing dust vacuumed from the shroud surface. They found a mix of human and plant DNA representing lineages from across a wide geographic range, including, notably, a significant proportion of DNA the team associated with the Indian subcontinent. This is real. It happened. But here's where the popular retelling and the actual science diverge sharply. Barcaccia's own interpretation of that Indian DNA signature wasn't this proves contact with pilgrims from Jerusalem to China. It was considerably more specific and considerably more mundane. He suggested it might indicate the linen itself was woven from flax grown or processed in India, historically a source region for fine textiles, and that the DNA reflected contamination accumulated over centuries of handling, not a record of a 2,000-year pilgrimage route. Then, in a follow-up metagenomic study, the same team went further and found something that should give any dramatic retelling pause. DNA from carrots, melons, red coral, cats, dogs, cattle, pigs, corn, peanuts, and bananas. Other geneticists in the field, including Anders Gutherström of Stockholm University and historian Andrea Nicolati, were notably unconvinced that any of this data could reliably reconstruct the shroud's history at all. Their point is a basic one in forensic genetics. A piece of cloth handled by thousands of people, animals, and objects over 7 centuries of documented European custody is going to accumulate an extraordinarily messy genetic signature, and metagenomics, sequencing everything present rather than isolating a single verified source, is exactly the kind of method that will produce a wide, noisy spread of ancestries without telling you which century or which continent any particular trace actually arrived from. Even Barcaccia has been careful to frame the results as suggestive of extensive exposure in the Mediterranean region, not as proof of a specific route through Edessa or Constantinople. The banana and peanut DNA is the tell here. Nobody seriously argues the shroud traveled to the Americas in antiquity, which means the genetic picture is dominated by post-medieval contamination, not ancient pilgrimage traffic. That doesn't make the DNA data worthless. It makes it exactly what a contested piece of evidence looks like, real, published, and read very differently by different experts. Not every strand of Shroud evidence is this contested. The pollen analysis, first conducted by Swiss criminologist Max Free in the 1970s and later expanded by botanist Avinoam Dannon of Hebrew University, is somewhat more durable, even though it too has critics. Dannon and Free identified pollen grains embedded in the linen fibers, including species native to the eastern Mediterranean and the arid corridor between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, alongside European species consistent with the Shroud's documented centuries in France and Italy. Among the more discussed finds is pollen from Gundelia ternifortii, a thorny plant that grows in the region and blooms in early spring, the same season and same general area, associated with the crucifixion narrative. Free's broader pollen work has drawn real methodological criticism over the years, particularly around sample collection and chain of custody, and not every botanist accepts his identifications. Still, the pollen evidence is one of the harder pieces to wave away entirely, because unlike a painted image, pollen grains are not something a medieval forger could deliberately plant at a microscopic level using any tool available in the 14th century. The blood analysis occupies similar territory, genuinely interesting, genuinely published, and genuinely argued over. In 2017, physicist Giulio Fanti of the University of Padua and colleagues examined the reddish stains using nanoparticle-level techniques and reported findings consistent with human blood showing markers associated with severe trauma. Fanti has been one of the Shroud's most persistent scientific advocates for years, and it's worth noting plainly that Fanti is also a co-author, alongside Liberato De Caro, on several of the alternative dating studies discussed below. The same small circle of researchers keeps appearing across multiple independent-sounding lines of evidence, which is a detail serious critics have flagged directly. That doesn't automatically make the blood findings wrong, but it does mean this isn't a case of 5 totally separate research groups independently converging on the same conclusion. It's closer to one closely linked network of Shroud specialists, producing a body of mutually supportive work, reviewed with real skepticism by geneticists, chemists, and textile scientists outside that circle. Here's where the story usually gets flattened into something simpler than it actually is. In 1988, 3 laboratories, Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, independently ran radiocarbon dating on a small Shroud sample and arrived at a remarkably consistent result, a date range of roughly 1260 to 1390 AD, squarely medieval, and consistent with the Shroud's earliest well-documented appearance in France in the 1350s. This was published in Nature and is, to this day, the only carbon-14 dating ever performed directly on the Shroud with full scientific rigor, cross-laboratory replication, and peer review. The claim that later circulated, that chemist Raymond Rogers definitively proved the sample was cut from an invisibly rewoven medieval patch, is a real hypothesis, and Rogers was a real, respected scientist who had worked on the 1978 STIRP investigation. He did publish research arguing the tested corner showed unusual chemical properties, suggesting later repair. But this is not a settled fact. It's a contested hypothesis. Numerous textile experts and members of the original 1988 dating teams have pushed back hard, arguing there is no reliable evidence of rewoven cotton contaminating the radiocarbon sample, and that the invisible medieval reweave story has never been demonstrated to the standard that would be needed to overturn 3 independent laboratory results. As of today, most textile scientists and much of the mainstream archaeological community still regard the 1988 medieval date as the best supported radiocarbon result the Shroud has ever received. The patch theory is a real scientific argument. It is not a scientific consensus. Then, in 2022, physicist Liberato De Caro and colleagues at Italy's Institute of Crystallography in Bari published a study using a genuinely different technique, wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS, which measures structural degradation in linen cellulose as a proxy for age rather than relying on radioactive decay. Working from a single small thread taken near the same corner used in 1988, De Caro's team compared its degradation profile to samples of known age, including linen from the Masada fortress in Israel dated to 55 to 74 AD, and reported a close match implying on this method a first-century origin. This is a real, published study, and it's the most scientifically serious challenge to the 1988 date to emerge in decades. It deserves to be taken seriously, and it deserves to be reported honestly, which means saying plainly that WXS dating of ancient linen is a new, experimental technique with a far smaller track record than radiocarbon dating, that it has been applied to only a handful of samples worldwide, and and that the study's own authors described the result as suggestive rather than conclusive. It's also worth noting, again, that Icaro has co-authored much of his shroud dating work directly alongside Giulio Fanti. The same overlapping circle of researchers reappears here too. Independent critics, including the historian Andrea Nicolati, have gone further and argued that this line of dating research has been received with real caution even by shroud-focused academic journals, some of which have explicitly urged readers not to treat these newer dating claims as reliable replacements for radiocarbon results. The honest state of play in mid-2026 is this: the WXS study is a legitimate, published challenge to the medieval date, but it has not displaced the 1988 result as the scientific mainstream position, and it likely won't until the method is validated across many more samples by researchers outside the small group currently producing it. If there's one piece of the Shroud story that holds up to scrutiny without needing to lean on contested studies, it's the image formation puzzle, and it's worth describing carefully rather than dramatically. Analysis by NASA researchers in the 1970s, using image processing equipment originally built for space photography, found that the intensity of the image at any given point corresponds to the distance between the cloth and a body it might have covered, a property sometimes described as encoding three-dimensional, or VP8, image information. That's a real, documented, and genuinely unusual finding. It is not something typically produced by a normal photograph or painting, which encodes light and shadow, not distance data. Later microscopic and spectroscopic work, including studies from Italy's ENEA research agency, found that the coloration exists only in an extremely thin surface layer of the linen fibers, on the order of a few hundred nanometers deep, with no evidence of pigment, paint binder, or capillary staining of the kind you'd expect from a brush or dye. Researchers attempting to replicate the coloration mechanically or chemically have had limited success, and a 2011 ENEA study noted that short, intense bursts of ultraviolet radiation could reproduce some, though not all, of the image's specific characteristics. While explicitly stopping short of claiming this explained the shroud's origin or implied anything about the mechanism that actually produced it historically. This is genuinely one of the more scientifically interesting open questions connected to the shroud. It is also frequently overstated. No one has fully replicated the coloration mechanism is not the same claim as no natural process could have produced it. Several alternative hypotheses exist in the literature, including a contact transfer imprint combined with age-related oxidation, a Maillard-type chemical reaction between amines and cloth, or a heated bas-relief technique, none of which has been definitively confirmed, but none of which has been ruled out either. The honest summary is that shroud image formation remains scientifically unresolved, not scientifically impossible. It would be easy to tell this story two ways. One version stitches together every intriguing data point, the DNA, the pollen, the blood chemistry, the WXS date, into an unbroken chain that proves the shroud wrapped a first-century crucifixion victim, glossing over the fact that several of these studies come from the same small, overlapping group of researchers, and that the mainstream radiocarbon result still stands unrefuted by broad scientific consensus. The other version dismisses the whole thing as a well-worn medieval hoax and moves on, ignoring the fact that genuinely strange, still unexplained aspects of the image really do exist, and that qualified researchers on multiple sides of this debate keep finding things worth publishing. The more accurate story sits in between, and it's more interesting for it. The Shroud of Turin is one of the most intensively studied objects in the world, examined by immunologists, textile chemists, physicists, botanists, and historians for over a century, and it has never produced a single unanimous verdict. The 1988 carbon date remains the most rigorously cross-validated scientific test ever performed on the cloth, and most of the scientific establishment still treats it as the best available answer, even as newer, smaller, less replicated studies chip away at that confidence from the edges. The genetic and botanical evidence is real, published, and worth taking seriously, while also being exactly the kind of messy, contamination-prone data that resists the tidy narrative it's often forced into. And the image itself remains a legitimate scientific puzzle, one that has outlasted a century of attempted replication without a fully satisfying answer in either direction. Maybe that's the more honest place to leave it. Not a verdict, but a live scientific argument, the kind where serious people, publishing in serious journals, still disagree, and where the cloth itself keeps outlasting every attempt to close the case for good. So the real question isn't whether the shroud has been proven or debunked. It's whether you're comfortable with a mystery that, after more than 100 years of study, still hasn't picked a side.